We have to remember that 40% of the world's oil comes to market via a cartel that would like to have elevated prices. And so oil is actually more expensive than it should be. It's more expensive than equilibrium would dictate it should be. This is, of course, a temporary thing. All cartels fail in the long run. OPEC has done a magnificent job for as long as they have been at this. The fact that OPEC is swinging their own production so that the price of oil doesn't fall below 70. Eventually it will, and when it does, it'll fall hard.
The war in the Middle East expands as Israel strikes Yemen, killing 4 people so far on the 26th of December that we know of. We'll be talking about how the escalations in the Middle East will impact the oil markets and energy overall. We'll be talking about the outlook for energy into 2025 with Doomberg. He is the head writer of the Doomberg Substack. Welcome back to the show, Doomberg. Good to see you.
David, before we dive in, I have to say, first of all, Merry Christmas, to you and yours. And I want to say how impressed I was with your I'll Be Home for Christmas video that you posted. I know that it won't be probably your most viewed or liked video of the year, but I certainly appreciated it. And I had no idea that you were such a Renaissance man. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Very talented. It was beautiful. And I genuinely mean it. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I appreciate it. I did a little music video. I was a musician before I knew anything about finance. So I enjoy sharing my passions once a year, hopefully more. But Doomberg, let's talk about some recent news coming out of the Middle East. Like I mentioned in the beginning, new developments with Israel now striking Yemen as they fight the Houthis. Now the Israeli forces have unleashed a series of strikes on the Yemen capital, killing at least 4 people and injuring more than a dozen others. They're striking the airport at the capital. 16 injured. A UN team was about to board a flight when the airport came under bombardment. And we can talk about the broader developments overall, but more specifically in regards to the energy markets, oil has not moved dramatically on the news. So tell us what's going on and why oil is not reacting. And I bring this up because Yemen is a major country on the border of the Red Sea. The Houthis have the capacity, in theory, to block off the Red Sea. It's a major choke point for oil exports. They do. That could really send oil prices higher, but oil prices aren't moving on that. Tell us what's happening.
I think you need to put today's breaking news, which is, as we're recording this, still developing, of course, in the context of the broader geopolitical picture, which I think is a series of moves ahead of the all-important January 20th inauguration of Donald Trump to the 47th president of the United States. We're seeing a lot of key actors around the world positioning themselves for what comes after that. I think the quote-unquote fall of Syria, Israel's move into Syria, tensions between Turkey and the Kurds, which are, of course, a U.S. proxy. So you actually have the prospect of 2 NATO countries fighting each other via proxy. One of the primary reasons why I think the substantive strike against the Houthis by Israel is not moving oil prices is because it to the extent that the Houthis have been, their capabilities have been degraded by this strike, it might limit their ability to prevent oil from getting out of the Middle East. Although, to be fair, they have not really interfered with global energy trade all that much, which kind of makes sense because most of the oil in the Middle East now goes to China, and China and Iran are allies, and the Houthis are, at least on paper, a proxy of the Iranians. Although it must be said, taking a step back, who knows who's ally in the Middle East and what is true and what is propaganda? I mean, it's so complicated with so much history of hostilities that it really is hard for Westerners like us to make sense of it all. The big winners in all of this are the military-industrial complex, because as long as the missiles are flying, when you're in the bomb-making business, peace is a working capital problem, and we certainly don't have a lot of peace at the moment.
So bottom line, Doomberg, are you expecting the Houthis to block off the Red Sea?
No. I think, it's not whether I'm expecting it or not. It's very clear that the markets aren't expecting it, as you mentioned, and we wouldn't be sitting here.
You could be right and the markets could be wrong. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, sure. But I tend to think that the market has been pretty accurate on the whole tensions in the Middle East all the way back since October 7th of the terrible events that happened in Israel on October 7th of 23. The markets have been very calm. They've seen through the headline. Look, the world is oversupplied with oil. I mean, there's just too much of it. And natural gas is cheap and abundant. And as the engines are being switched and their prices are converging, and we're seeing a very balanced, well-supplied market And it would take a substantial escalation from where we are today for oil prices to react meaningfully. And if they did, it would be an opportunity to fade it because these types of things always regress back to the mean. The physical markets are oversupplied. There's tension in the Middle East, forever thus. And the markets seem rather mature about it and are seeing right through it. And in fact, the big question on the board is how smooth is the transition from here to January 20th? I mean, already today, the Hill is out with a piece saying, here's how Congress can stop Trump from becoming president. I mean, it's not 100% clear to us that this will be as smooth as the market is pricing in. And so we'll have to see. But I do think much of this can be explained by the so-called Trump effect. Like him or lump him, he does have a huge effect on geopolitical activities. And a lot of people are trying to sort of get theirs while the going is good until Biden is gone. And then when Trump comes in, I think we're going to see a whole new set of rules.
You mentioned that all this leads to January 20th. What will happen after the inauguration? I ask this because presumably what he plans to do, Trump plans to do, is already priced into the markets, is it not?
Yes, that's part of the reasons why I think oil is not necessarily flying on this news, because Trump is bearish for oil prices, bullish for oil production. I think Trump doesn't really care about foreign wars, and Trump is fully prepared to do whatever it takes to find peace and to get the economy going again. And so that comes with pluses and minuses for the U.S.'s geopolitical adversaries. Like, it's very clear what he wants to do, which in a way sort of dissipates his leverage.
Yes.
But at the same time, like, Trump is a deal-making business guy. He wants to cut deal. I guarantee you he's going to meet with Putin in the early months of his presidency. They will find a resolution, hopefully, to the situation in Ukraine. I think all right-thinking people should want hostilities to end. It's been a terrible war on all sides, with a massive loss of life and destruction of citizen infrastructure. I would reiterate our condemnation of Putin's attacks on the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. We believe these are war crimes. They had another one on Christmas Day, which is sad. I mean, war is the ultimate failure of diplomacy. I think wantonly attacking critical energy infrastructure, the way in which people heat their homes or get their fresh water, those are war crimes. And I think we should call them out. Lots of blame to go around, but war is terrible. War is the failure of diplomacy, and Trump doesn't want war. He wants peace. I see this morning that Putin was signaling that he is prepared to end the hostilities in Ukraine. I think there's a lot of pre-positioning for the chessboard that will be there on January 20th. What happens after that is kind of like a singularity, a geopolitical singularity. It's hard to model. Let's get to the 20th first and see what happens. But we're in a very dangerous time right now, to be honest with you. I mean, we have less than a month to go. If something happens to Trump or something happens that interferes with the peaceful transfer of power, and neither of those are completely off the board, I think, who knows, all bets are off after that. It's a very dangerous time, but I take solace in the relative passivity of the oil markets in particular, because they're signaling that they've sort of priced all of this risk in and they're comfortable with it. As you say, markets can be wrong, but in the absence of information, directly measured with our own hands and eyes and ears, we have to rely on what the market is telling us.
Let's assume that the war in Ukraine ends after the inauguration somehow. Okay, we can speculate as to how. What will happen to natural gas in Europe, particularly the price? Do you think that Russia will supply Europe with the same amount of natural gas as it did before the war?
So the big milestone we're watching is whether the Power of Siberia 2 gets greenlit by China. And I think that is the big sort of binary event that will dictate decades of future energy flows. There exists still a significant Nord Stream pipeline. One of the 4 pipelines is undamaged by the attack. There exists still significant overland pipelines that go through Ukraine, for example, that are undamaged by the war. Miraculously, I would say. I would have assumed that those would have been hit by a terrorist attack or other hostile activities by now, but it hasn't. There's all manner of pipelines that flow to Ukraine, Turk Stream being one of them. And so in a world where peace is reached, however it happens, and as you say, it seems impossible from here, or certainly very difficult, there's a chance that the abundant natural gas molecules and oil and refined products that Russia has could flow back to Europe. cause prices to go down dramatically, put an end to, or at least slow down German deindustrialization. But if the Power of Siberia 2 is greenlit, this is a pipeline that would go from the prolific natural gas fields in Siberia to China, permanently redirecting those molecules away from Europe to the Chinese manufacturing base. I think that would be sort of a death blow to European industrial capacity for a decade. It'd be a long winter for Europe. And so this is the big move on the board. We're starting to see rumblings that maybe China will go ahead and greenlight that project. They've been resistant because they've been holding out for a better price.
Right.
But that's the big project on the board. So I know it's sort of an indirect, we always look for these indirect milestones to keep us ahead of the news flow. If we see Power Siberia 2 approved, that greatly diminishes the chance for peace, in our view, because those molecules will have a new market.
Well, I'm wondering how Russia's trading partners may change following, let's say, a de-escalation of the Ukraine war. Take a look at this article, for example. India's imports of Russian crude oil dropped in November of this year to its lowest level since June 2022. The Kremlin continues to be the biggest source of oil for India. So there's been a shift of, trading priorities for Russia after the war. But interestingly, India's imports of oil from Russia dropped by a massive 55% in November. Is this an India specific issue whereby it's a country demand thing, or are just trade flows between India and Russia just diminishing? What's going on there?
The sanctions war has continued with their sort of tit for tat, and what typically happens is the West concocts a whole new series of sanctions, and it takes a bit of time for countries like India and Russia to circumvent them. And so what has been going on now, I believe, that explains this relatively short-term drop in oil imports to India, is the West has been sanctioning Russia's so-called shadow fleet. These are the fleet of tankers that are not insured by British insurance companies, basically, if you wanted to give it the simplest. It's a little more complex than that, but for the point of simplicity, let's go with that definition. And so it has had an impact on the flows of volume of Russian crude and finished products. And LNG, there was an article, I believe, in the Financial Times today about an LNG tank cargo ship that sailed all around the world and found no buyers. I mean, these roadblocks that the West have been putting up will occasionally and temporarily cause certain banks to not, cover any transactions and so on. And so there's complications. They eventually get worked out. I think it takes time. But to your broader question of, let's say, peace erupts, everybody that has benefited because of this will feel pain, and everybody that has felt pain because of this will benefit. I just kind of view this as a negating event. And so India has benefited greatly from the sanctions war because it has been willing and thus far mostly able to take advantage of relatively cheap flows of oil from Russia. By the way, no small irony, the U.S. East Coast was bailed out of a mini diesel crisis last year because we were importing diesel refined in India that was, made with Russian crude. So the molecules will find their way to the market. The trading houses always find a way. To the extent that these sanctions increase frictions in the market, it can, on balance, help Russia because it keeps prices artificially high. If peace broke out today, Russia would not be making profit on its oil because oil would drop below its break-even price.
I see. So you're not expecting the Eastern trading blocks of oil to remain independent from the rest of the world, meaning a permanent bifurcation of oil markets after peace?
No. I think, look, oil is a necessary commodity. So we had a great guest on one of our Doom Zoom podcasts, our good friend Jack Johnston of the Market Vibe Substack. And he said, look, if you just take the view of oil from outer space, it was a brilliant way to look at it. 100 million barrels a day flowing all over the world from oil fields to refineries on ships and floating inventories, and the speed with which new wells can be brought online and the economic viability of energy resources has never been higher. It's just this beating heart of energy, 100 million barrels a day. And it is impossible, really, for any government or geopolitical actor to keep a lid on those flows for very long. And they find a way of working themselves out. I mean, these molecules are fungible, they're interchangeable. All manner of shell companies, they'll find a way to get around this insurance roadblock that has recently been thrown up. They are now sanctioning specific tankers. Well, they'll just move it to other tankers, right? Or they'll rename the tankers and put them in a different shell company and make them hard to find. I'm just making up examples, but the molecules are so valuable. The demand for them is insatiable. they all will eventually get burned by somebody somewhere. It's just a matter of the friction of the transition and the prices involved.
One other area we need to discuss is China. So take a look at my screen here. This is from Reuters a couple of days ago. China, actually today, as a matter of fact, oil prices ease on the day on the trading session as markets weighed China's stimulus hopes. Chinese authorities have agreed to issue 3 trillion yuan, roughly $411 billion worth of special treasury bonds next year. Reuters reported on Tuesday, citing two sources. Beijing ramps up fiscal stimulus to revive a faltering economy. Again, not a lot of movement from the oil markets. Not too excited about the prospect of the largest importer of oil in the world stimulating their economy. Why is that?
So two things. China is switching towards natural gas at the margins, which it doesn't take much in the way of incremental demand shifting to significantly affect the price of inelastic commodities. But the thing you'll notice about this article, which I'm reading in front of me, is that 69.79. Look, oil is a managed price. OPEC would like to keep the price of oil between $70 and $90 a barrel, preferably closer to $90 a barrel. We've been sitting at the low end of OPEC's desired range for months, right? We have been bouncing off of $70. $70 is long-term support because OPEC will just produce less or release less oil into the markets. Like, people look at the oil prices though it is a organically derived market signal. It's a managed market. We have to remember that 40% of the world's oil comes to market via a cartel that would like to have elevated prices. And so oil is actually more expensive than it should be. It's more expensive than equilibrium would dictate it should be. This is, of course, a temporary thing. All cartels fail in the long run. OPEC has done a magnificent job for as long as they have been at this. But yeah, the price of $70 has nothing to do with stimulus in China. It has to do with demand switching away from diesel towards liquefied natural gas and long-haul trucks in China, and the fact that OPEC is swinging their own production so that the price of oil doesn't fall below 70. Eventually it will, and when it does, it'll fall hard. Unless we have, the Houthis blow up the Middle East, or, pick your favorite geopolitical calamity, a nuclear war in Ukraine, which is not off the table.
Right.
But the market is not signaling that. So oil is overpriced, natural gas is underpriced, and arbitrage will work its magic.
Do you think there will be more geopolitical escalations in the Middle East in particular if oil falls, let's say, below $69 towards 60, towards 50? The lower it goes, the more tensions. Does that make sense?
Yes, I believe that is a very fair way to model the world.
Okay.
But I think all bets are off on January 20th, right? So we have, 3.5 weeks to go. And we'll find out how the world looks after that. And again, if you told me right now that oil went to above $100 between now and January 20th, I would take that as a signal that something happened in the transition. I think if you ask me what is the one thing the market is underpricing, it's the risk of a non-peaceful transition. Trump is. Look, I went back and watched all of his Agenda 47 videos that he published in March 2023.
Yeah.
Like the old adage used to be that you should take Trump seriously, but not literally. I think if you watch those videos, he is literally doing everything he promised or pledged that he would do. And that he's taking on some very powerful people. And these people aren't sitting there with no cards to play. And look, there's been a lot of, it's been a tough 4 years. Let's put it that way, for democracies around the world. Our definition of democracy is under significant threat at the moment. We're canceling elections in Romania. Right-wing parties are winning election after election in Europe, but somehow never being allowed to form the government. We had a very close election here in the U.S., which Trump prevailed. The people on the losing end of this election have some capabilities and have a track record of deploying those capabilities. Like, this is not, in our view, a stone cold deadlock that everything just happens per tradition in the United States. We've already had a very unprecedented campaign, 2 assassination attempts.
Yeah.
Joe Biden being pulled out by his own party because he was too mentally gone to run, but he still remains president. Who's the president? This article in the Wall Street Journal this weekend was incredible. It truly is a dangerous time, and I think people are perhaps underpricing that risk.
Okay, speaking of Agenda 47, good segue. So let's take a listen to what Trump said about making America energy independent again. I'm not going to play the whole thing. Just the first 30 seconds. Take a listen, and we'll evaluate market impacts.
Joe Biden's war on American energy is one of the key drivers of the worst inflation in 58 years, and it's hitting every single American family very, very hard. Biden reversed every action I took that achieved energy independence, and soon we were going to be energy dominant all over the world, energy dominant. He canceled the Keystone XL pipeline. He re-entered the horrendous Paris Climate Accord, so unfair to the United States, good for other countries, so bad for us. He put up huge roadblocks to new oil, gas, and coal production, and much, much more. In effect, Biden's anti-American energy crusade is a massive tax hike on everything. Higher energy costs raise the price of food, raw materials, shipping, transportation, construction, manufacturing, and everything else. The country that now benefits most from Joe Biden's radical left Green New Deal is China.
All right, let's send it here. Okay, first of all, what is he referring to? And Biden's policies maybe not as pro oil as Trump's, but energy production, oil production in the U.S. was still at an all-time high in the last couple of years, as you know. I'll just let you comment. I thought the U.S. was already energy independent. So what is he talking about here?
He's talking about the fact that the reason we're energy independent has very little to do with Washington, D.C. It has to do with the fact that at the state level, we have a lot of autonomy in permitting new energy developments. Look, California and Texas have roughly the same amount of oil and gas. One of them is a global energy superpower, and the other is a flaccid energy vassal. Those are political choices. Texas has chosen to make the U.S. an energy superpower. So has Oklahoma. So has Louisiana. So has North Dakota. To an extent, so has Alaska, Pennsylvania, Ohio. The Marcellus Shale. So what Trump is talking about, and what his incoming Treasury Secretary has stated as one of the administration's goals, is an extra 3 million barrels a year of oil production. Yeah. Removing standard trick, for example, that Biden did was they radically expanded the areas that are listed as national monuments, which is a backdoor way to forbid oil and gas drilling on federal lands. They all manner of things. They put a pause on new LNG export approvals. So there's a lot of things that Biden's EPA and his overall administration have done to stunt U.S. oil and gas production. And I would argue the U.S. is a global energy gigapower in spite of the Biden administration, not because of it. And what Trump is talking about is basically what we have been calling for many years, which is this is the way you defeat Putin, by the way. You crush energy prices and you limit his ability to profit from Russia's abundant energy exports. And I would say that Trump's nomination of Chris Wright to be Secretary of Energy was a profoundly bullish sign for U.S. energy production, which is bearish for U.S. energy prices and bearish for U.S. energy equities, which is a point we've been making for many months. So that's very consistent with his behavior since winning the election. And even on the Joe Rogan podcast, he when Rogan asked him how he would defeat Putin, he said, I would drive the price of oil below $42. Right. Because that's Putin's break-even price. And so he's somebody on his team. Look, Chris Wright, I'm not giving away any secrets. Chris Wright was a fan of Doomberg's. We were on a podcast together. I think he agrees with much of our analysis, and now he's the Secretary of Energy. I mean, it's good for him. Well, nominated at least. We'll see if he gets approval. He doesn't seem to be a controversial nomination at this point. So I think, like our friends who are bullish energy commodities aren't listening to Trump. Like you heard that clip. Are you going to go buy oil at $70 based on that clip? Of course not. You might buy service providers who make more money based on volume produced, but you're not going to go buy E&Ps or the commodity itself.
By the way, $42 a barrel. Yeah, okay, that would hurt Russia. That would also bankrupt a lot of other countries, right? It would hurt OPEC. It would probably bankrupt Venezuela more than it already has. It's just the side effects of $42 a barrel would be
right. And then the Exxons and the Chevrons of the world will buy all of these amazing assets on the cheap, and then we'll have another crisis and we'll have another shortage, and they'll make scores of billions of dollars. It's forever thus. Look, the global energy demand curve is an upward sloping sine curve. It's a little sine wave, and people always draw tangent lines to this sine wave foolishly, betting against greater human energy consumption is a sucker's trade. We will produce more. We will consume more. Sometimes the energy producers will make a ton of money. Sometimes they'll lose a lot of money. In the years where they lose a lot of money, the big players buy up all the good assets on the cheap, and onward and upward. This is the story of the oil and gas markets for a century. But Trump is signaling, and we think he should be taken literally, that he will remove every federal barrier to more oil and gas production that he can with the stroke of his pen. We don't think he'll get much done through Congress, by the way, but he does have all of these precedents of executive action are dangerous because sometimes the other team wins. And Trump has had 4 years to study what went wrong with his first administration, what happened in 2020, and what he would do differently if he won again. He is doing all the things in those videos. And I would encourage everybody listening to Google Agenda 47 Trump videos and watch them. You will then understand basically everything Trump is doing. And it's pretty remarkable. That's why I'm saying he's coming up against some very powerful forces, proposing to do very drastic things. And he has made his plan widely available for everyone to know. There's going to be a lot of very powerful people who don't like those plans. And they have some tools, and we suspect they might try to deploy them before January 20th.
Well, let's take a look at how feasible is the plan to increase oil production by 3 million barrels a day. Currently, I think they're updated numbers, but as of 2023, the EIA's data indicates that there's roughly 12.9 to roughly 13 million barrels of crude oil produced per day by the U.S. Petroleum industry. 3 million additional barrels would roughly equal 20% more, right? If my math is, how are we going to get there? An additional 20% more production.
Yeah, if you count the NGLs and the sort of the statistical review of world energy definition of oil is crude oil, condensates, and natural gas liquids, and by that measure, we're at 20 million barrels a day.
Yeah.
20, like the 100 million barrels a day quoted number includes all three of those categories. And so 3 million barrels a day against that definition is more like 15%. But just the signaling power of it alone is very powerful. And look, one thing we've been watching with great interest, Trump's various Truth Social posts about Greenland and the Panama Canal and Governor Trudeau. You mentioned something very interesting earlier, which is Venezuela, right? They used to produce 4 million barrels a day, down to a low of 350,000 barrels a day, probably double that now. Venezuela is sitting on the largest hydrocarbon resource in the world. Greenland is blessed with all manner of resources, rare earths, everything that the U.S. military needs that China currently controls. Panama Canal is influenced by China heavily today. Canada, second largest hydrocarbon resource in the world. I think Trump is going to revisit the Monroe Doctrine. I think U.S. foreign policy is going to focus on the Western Hemisphere. I think he's going to pull the troops out of Syria. He said as much. He's going to let China police the Middle East because that's where China gets its energy. He's going to cut a deal with Russia. And I think we're going to compete against the Chinese with the Western Hemisphere as all of the bullets in the U.S. barrel. And there's plenty here. We don't need, this is a point we've been making for many, many months. The Western Hemisphere already produces more oil than the Middle East. If you take Canada, the U.S., Mexico, Venezuela, Brazil, Colombia, there's Guyana, by the way, right? Like there's Cuba. I suspect that the U.S. under Trump will probably lift sanctions on Cuba, and we will have a bit of a reconciliation there. I think that's been a tragedy, by the way, and I think U.S. sanctions policy has been outrageous. So if you just put sort of bookends around the Western Hemisphere and let the U.S. sort of dominate that, you're talking about a superpower of unparalleled dimensions. We don't need the Middle East. We don't need to be in Ukraine. We don't really need Taiwan. We have plenty here. And I think Trump's main objective is economic boom, the fiscal and economic well-being of U.S. citizens, and all of these actions that he's everyone just sort of laughs and thinks it's trolling, and he's a master troll. Like let's not give the man his due, but when you put it all together, you can see the elements of a master plan coming together. Stop the wars, get out of the Middle East, protect Israel, but focus on the Western Hemisphere. Drill, baby, drill here. drive the price of oil down, let the U.S. super majors buy up all the good assets on the cheap. There's a long-term vision here that people are underestimating in our view.
How does driving the oil price down fit into a longer term plan, his master plan? I know about the fighting Russia bit, but what else?
So cheap energy makes for booming economies, and Trump wants the economy to boom. Look, if oil went to 150 today, we would both immediately instinctively say, oh, there's going to be a recession. Okay, what does the opposite mean? Economic boom, right? If you have cheap, abundant energy, the energy companies don't do well, but everybody else does. The U.S. manufacturing base is massively advantaged today because of dirt cheap natural gas, which is the cleanest burning hydrocarbon on the board. We have hundreds and hundreds of cogeneration facilities that create both heat and electricity from natural gas, and they have a huge discount to the rest of the world. This is what Trump wants. He's very literal in those videos. Just go and listen to the videos. Like, it's all right there.
Cheap, abundant energy. You wrote about, I'm going to share your Substack now, if you don't mind. You wrote about fusion in one of your latest pieces. Commonwealth Fusion Systems, a startup founded by scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of MIT, said on Tuesday that it planned to build its first fusion power plant in Virginia with an aim of generating zero emissions electricity there in the early 2030s. Well, that's not too far off. What are your thoughts on this? Science fiction or science fact?
It's science fiction, if we're being honest. I mean, to be fair to the company, they were transparent. They have not yet achieved Q greater than 1, which is sort of more energy out than energy in. This is something that was demonstrated 2 years ago by a U.S. government lab. They just announced that if they solve the technology, they will build a plant. It's kind of a bit of a sleight of hand. We had a little fun with them in this piece. Look, fusion is an unnecessary distraction from fission. The problems fusion purports to solve are fake. The latest fission reactor designs have all but eliminated meltdown risk. And there's no such thing as nuclear waste. Nuclear waste can be recycled. We only use 5% of the embodied energy in a uranium fuel rod today. You pass it through a fast breeder reactor, deal with the plutonium, and you get the energy, gets a second and third and fourth swing before we truly call it nuclear waste. Fusion is a distraction from fission. It's a hype cycle. I enjoy
fusion would just generate more energy per unit of input.
No. I mean, the fusion is always. We jokingly said in the comments to this piece that fusion has been 2 decades away for at least 5 decades. So fusion is a distraction from fission. If we truly cared about carbon, we would build fission nuclear reactors all over the world, like China is, by the way. Fusion is an interesting science to study, and I'm sure something useful will come out of it. But you and I will be long retired from this business before the first commercially viable fusion power plant is built.
Okay, so nothing to change Trump's plan in the immediate future.
No.
On the cheap energy front. I mean, any other sources of energy that you could see that could, on the horizon that would impact the economy?
Yeah, the one we've been chronicling a couple times this year, and keep an eye on it. It's not guaranteed, but this whole concept of natural hydrogen had sort of a breakthrough year in 2024. So for the longest time, people didn't believe that hydrogen existed underground in a way that you could drill for it directly. And hydrogen was always a energy carrier, a poor one at that, because you put a lot of energy into split water, you make hydrogen, you burn your hydrogen somewhere else. You get half as much energy out as you put in. But if you could drill for hydrogen in the way that we drill for natural gas, that would be a true game changer. We wrote a piece a couple of months ago about a Joe Manchin Senate committee hearing. The piece was titled "In Search of the Next Shale." The USGS just came out with a new report published in a peer-reviewed journal that estimates that there's an enormous amount of hydrogen underground. And if only a tiny fraction of it was economically accessible, and we're starting to see signs that it will be, this would be a total game changer. And this is something that we've put on the board for our readers. Again, not a slam dunk, but shale wasn't a slam dunk in '07, right? And then all of a sudden, shale changed the world. And so we're always trying to keep an eye out for what the next shale will be. The way this works, by the way, is because there's huge iron deposits underground. When water reacts with iron, it creates hydrogen, and then through all manner of geological forces, some formations exist that can trap that hydrogen underground. And then if you could just drill for it, all this drilling technology of the shale revolution is paying off in 2 different ways. There's natural hydrogen, which I just described, and there's also geothermal. I keep an eye on that. The ability to drill economically at depth opens up all manner of other energy resources as well. Look, the human endeavor is a constant, unrelenting struggle against the forces of entropy, and so far we're undefeated. And I think we will find the next energy source. We will build the next fission reactors. We will crack geothermal. We will discover natural hydrogen. There's an unlimited supply of natural gas, and we'll have plenty of oil too. That's our view.
Okay. Finally, I want to touch on an article you wrote about Alberta, a little bit closer to home where I live in Canada. A storm is brewing in the energy-rich Canadian province. Can you just summarize this December 7th piece for us, keeping in mind that the Liberal Party is in shambles right now? There's calls of Trudeau to step down even from his own cabinet. So we may or may not see an election pretty soon. How is this transition from presumably the Liberals to the Conservatives, which are winning in the polls, going to affect Alberta and thus the energy market?
Yeah, so Canada's probably close to both of our hearts for different reasons. But very few people in the U.S. have a deep understanding of Canadian politics, especially the whole issue of equalization payments and the frictions that causes in Western Canada, where all the oil and gas is produced, and the whole separatist movement in Quebec, and the fact that Canadian borders are redrawn at a pretty regular basis, right? I mean, we drew the Northwest Territories, and Newfoundland didn't become a province until quite recently. Canada has only recently really sort of solidified its constitution and its independence from Britain, but Quebec hasn't formally signed that. And there's always been a simmering 20 to 30% Alberta independence. Fringe is probably too strong of a word, but at the exterior of Western Canadian politics. And as you correctly said, Justin Trudeau is deeply unpopular, looks set to get wiped out in the next election, unless some major political event happens. And in that piece, we speculated whether Mark Carney might take Trudeau's spot on the ticket and make the race a bit more competitive than the market is currently pricing. But we like to write a good Canadian piece every 6 months or so, and Alberta Clipper was a fun one of those.
Great. Well, any changes to the Canadian production side? We talked about American production, but any changes you see happening to Alberta's production going into the future that may impact energy markets?
Yeah, very bullish. The new pipeline that allows oil to flow basically to China, the new LNG export terminal on the coast of British Columbia that's being built. There's a huge amount of natural gas and oil in Alberta and British Columbia. I think the two provinces combined have grown their natural gas production to 7 BCF per day. No end in sight. We estimated in the piece that there was centuries worth of oil and gas in the what's it called, the Western Canadian sedimentary basin. Mm-hmm. It's just an enormous resource. The world is swimming in hydrocarbons. It's just politics in the way. That resource encompasses the entirety of Alberta, half of Saskatchewan, part of northeast British Columbia, even into the territories. So it's a huge resource base, much to be developed. And again, part of Trump's Western Hemisphere, I think it's no coincidence that he is amping up this governor talk in 51st state, having some fun with Justin Trudeau, of course, because I think he would prefer a conservative counterpart north of the border. But Trudeau is not long for the political stage, just a matter of when. And I think Canadian oil and gas supply is headed in the same direction as U.S.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. Where can we learn more about you, Doomberg?
Doomberg.com. So step one, subscribe to this channel and like this video. And then step two, head over to Doomberg.com and check our work out.
Yeah, great Substack. So we'll put the link down below. We can read more of Doomberg's work. I gave 2 teasers already. Read more by subscribing. Thank you very much, Doomberg. We appreciate it. And Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you, David. And looking forward to our next discussion. Always a great time.
Yeah, speak in 2025. And thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.